Every Pokemon journey has a rival. Some pushed you forward, some made you angry, some made you feel genuinely bad for winning. Here is every major rivalry in franchise history, ranked from the one that barely registered to the one that defined what a rival was supposed to be. Let's break this down. Brendan and May, they gave you a potion after you beat them. That is the complete summary of what separated the Hoenn rivals from every preceding counterpart in the franchise. After the battle concluded, regardless of outcome, Brendan or May reached into their bag and handed the player a potion with the specific energy of someone who was genuinely pleased that the fight had happened at all. No grudge, no brooding departure, no suggestion that the loss had produced anything other than positive feelings about the experience and warm wishes for the player's continued journey. Brendan and May were the children of Professor Birch, which meant their engagement with Pokemon research was familial rather than institutional, and their relationship with the player was built around that context. Two kids who grew up around the same academic environment doing the same thing because both of them found it genuinely interesting. The competitive dimension that every prior rivalry had treated as essential was absent. They chose the starter that was type advantaged against the player's selection. They improved their teams across the game's story beats. They showed up periodically to check in, and they expressed what appeared to be sincere happiness about the player's progress throughout. The community's retrospective assessment of Brendan and May as rivals has been consistent and direct. They were the nicest rivals the franchise had ever produced, and the niceness came at the cost of any reason to care about the outcome of the battles. Nobody lost sleep over defeating someone who responded to defeat with a potion. How? The community stopped calling him a rival, and the game's own text suggested they had a point. How's presence in Sun and Moon was built around enthusiasm, malasadas, and a genuine delight in Pokemon battles that communicated a person who was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do, with a level of comfort in that situation that most rivals the franchise had produced would have found incomprehensible. His grandfather was Hala, the Melemele Island kahuna, and subsequently the first member of Alola's Elite Four, a familial pressure point that the games acknowledged through How's stated desire to become stronger than Hala, but that never manifested as the specific psychological weight that pressure should have carried. His team always included a starter Pokemon at a type disadvantage to the player's selection, an Alolan Raichu, an Evolution, and a Kamala that the games treated as a recurring presence in his party despite Kamala spending most of its time asleep. He battled the player 7 times in Sun and Moon and 6 times in Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon before appearing as the final boss of the main game in the Ultra versions, which was the franchise's most counterintuitive rival placement, the cheerful Malasada enthusiast positioned as the climactic challenge of a Pokemon game. The community's critique of How was not that he was poorly written, but that the game's architecture around him was designed for a more competitive character, and that the mismatch between his personality and his mechanical role produced something the franchise had never quite seen before. A rival the player genuinely could not take seriously as an obstacle. Hop. He was trying to be Leon before he knew he was not Leon. The Galar rivals' defining characteristic across Sword and Shield's main story was the specific kind of hero worship that converts the admired person into an impossible standard. Hop's older brother Leon was the undefeated champion of Galar, had never lost a single official match, and was the most prominent person in the region's collective consciousness, and Hop had spent his entire childhood in that shadow in the specific way that younger siblings sometimes do, measuring every achievement against what the person ahead of them had done at the same age. His battle team leaned on type disadvantaged starters and underleveled Pokemon across the game's early sections, which the franchise presented as honest rather than as negligence. Hop was not a bad trainer. He was a trainer who had not yet found what kind of trainer he actually was beneath the borrowed ambition. The game's most significant contribution to the rivalry concept was the sequence where Hop genuinely broke down after repeated losses, questioning whether he had any path forward that was not simply trying to replicate his brother's success in his brother's field. His eventual discovery that his actual vocation was Pokemon research rather than championship battling was the franchise's most direct engagement with the idea that the competition at the center of every rivalry was sometimes the wrong competition. That the player winning the Pokemon battles was never going to be what resolved Hop's actual problem, which was that he needed to stop measuring his life against someone else's. Calem Serena, The game gave you a rival based on which gender you chose for the player character, which meant half the player base fought Calem and half fought Serena, and both groups were fighting a character who existed primarily to fill the rival slot that the game's actual personality investment had been placed into Shauna, Tierno, and Trevor. The Generation 6 rival structure was the franchise's most dispersed, 5 characters sharing the narrative space that Blue and Silver had occupied alone, with the designated Calem or Serena taking the competitive role while the other 3 covered the friendship arc, the hobby arc, and the general supportive presence that surrounded the player through Kalos. Calem or Serena's team at their strongest on Victory Road included an Evolution, a Meowstic, an Altaria, an Absol, and a starter Pokemon, whose type advantage shifted based on the player's selection, a composition that communicated genuine competitive preparation without the personality to make the player care about the person who had assembled it. The franchise community's consensus was that the Generation 6 rival was the most technically competent and least emotionally resonant of any rival since Brendan and May. A character who existed, who trained, who showed up when required, and who left no particular impression on the people who battled them. The decision to split the rival role across 5 characters in Kalos produced a group dynamic that was genuinely warm, and a dedicated rival whose specific presence was correspondingly diluted. Barry. He fined people for getting in his way. Barry's introduction in Sinnoh involved running directly into the player character, blaming the player character for the collision, and immediately threatening a financial penalty for the delay caused, an energy the game maintained across every subsequent Barry encounter, with the specific consistency of a character whose defining traits were not incidental, but structural. He was the son of Palmer, one of the Battle Frontier's frontier brains, and a trainer whose own competitive record made Barry's ambitions at least partly hereditary, and the franchise used this familial context to give Barry's relentless pace a foundation beyond simple hyperactivity. He always challenged the player, always left before fully finishing what he was saying, always arrived somewhere slightly ahead of the player, and slightly less prepared than he should have been given his speed of arrival. In the anime, his adaptation as one of Ash's Sinnoh rivals preserved his core quality, a trainer who moved faster than he thought and whose mistakes were always energetic rather than passive, while giving him the additional dimension of a rivalry with Paul, whose contrasting philosophies about training produced the Sinnoh series' most interesting secondary character dynamic. Barry believed in his Pokemon's potential through encouragement at the same speed he applied to everything else. Paul believed in elimination of the inadequate. The franchise positioned Barry's approach for all its chaos as the correct one, which was a statement about friendship and cultivation delivered through a character who owed someone an enormous sum of money and kept forgetting to collect. Cheren and Bianca. The franchise gave the player 2 rivals in Generation 5 and made both of them matter for different reasons. Cheren wanted to be strong. This desire was expressed clearly, consistently, and without apology from the first scene of Black and White. He took the starter Pokemon with a type advantage over the players. He engaged every battle with the seriousness of someone who considered each loss information about what needed to improve, and he maintained his competitive posture across the game's entirety with the specific intensity of someone who had decided strength was the most important thing before the game began and had not yet been challenged on that assumption. The challenge came from Alder, the champion's observation that strength without purpose was simply force, and that a Pokemon trainer who could not articulate what they were training for, had not actually understood what training was, reached Cheren at the moment the franchise needed it to and produced a rival whose arc concluded with him becoming a gym leader, someone who had decided his purpose was to be a foundation for other trainers to develop against. Bianca wanted to be free. Her father's resistance to her journey was the most grounded parental concern the franchise had depicted, not villainy, not obtuseness, but a parent who loved his daughter and could not process the gap between that love and the specific form her happiness took. She was not a strong battler. She was not trying to be. Her arc ending with her becoming a Pokemon researcher working under Professor Juniper was the franchise's clearest statement that becoming stronger was never the only valid conclusion to a rivalry. Wally, he was too sick to catch his first Pokemon alone. The game assigned you to accompany him. You watched him catch a Ralts while Wally was visibly nervous, visibly weak, visibly uncertain whether the thing he wanted most was something he was physically capable of pursuing. And then Wally moved to Verdanturf Town for his health, and the narrative suggested you might not see him again. Then he showed up in Victory Road. The Wally who appeared at the end of Hoenn's gym circuit was not the same character the game had introduced catching a Ralts while you supervised. He was a trainer whose team included a Magneton, an Altaria, a Delcatty, a Rosalia, and a Gardevoir, evolved from the Ralts he had caught that day, a composition assembled by someone who had spent the entire game working toward this specific confrontation while the player was doing the same. His battle against Wally and Emerald was one of the most mechanically difficult trainer battles in the Generation 3 mainline games, which was the franchise's statement about what happened when the character it had introduced as the most fragile had the most to prove. He had not been following the player or competing in the conventional sense. He had been pursuing his own journey simultaneously and had arrived at the same final destination by a completely different path. His absence from most of the game and his appearance at its climax compressed 3 games' worth of character development into a single battle that the player understood fully because the game had given them the context from the first scene and trusted them to carry it. Gladion. He was carrying his family's secrets by himself. When Gladion appeared as Team Skull's enforcer in Alola, the information available about him was limited to surface detail. A trainer who had affiliated himself with an organization operating outside the law, who battled with intensity that felt personal rather than professional, who carried a type null in a restraining mask, and whose relationship to the Pokémon suggested a history neither he nor the game was ready to disclose immediately. The disclosure came in pieces. His mother was Lusamine, head of the Ether Foundation and the game's primary antagonist. His sister was Lily, who was also present in the player's journey. He had left home not because he was criminal in nature, but because the situation at home was something he could not fix from inside it, and could not walk away from without taking something that might eventually address it. Type: Null had been created by the Ether Foundation to counter Ultra Beasts. Gladion had taken it. His battles against the player across Sun and Moon carried the specific weight of confrontations between two people who were both trying to address the same problem through different approaches without knowing the other was doing the same thing. His eventual collaboration with the player against his mother was the franchise's most emotionally layered rival resolution. A rival whose hostility had never been about the player, whose battles had been practiced for something more important, and whose family situation the player had just helped him partially resolve. Hugh. He was not looking for the player, he was looking for Team Plasma. Hugh's rivalry in Black 2 and White 2 was the franchise's most goal-directed. A trainer whose motivation for every battle was not competitive growth or personal development, but the specific, documented fact that Team Plasma had stolen his sister's Pokémon before the game began, and he was going to get it back. Every encounter with Hugh across the sequel games was filtered through this mission. He trained to get stronger so that Team Plasma could not simply remove him again. He engaged the player because their paths intersected through their shared conflicts with the organization, and his emotional register in battle was the specific intensity of someone who was not treating this as a competition, but as preparation for something that mattered in a way that gym badges did not. The franchise used this to produce the Generation 5 sequel's most interesting rival dynamic, a character whose arc was not about learning what he wanted, but about pursuing what he already knew he wanted against obstacles he could not always overcome alone. His team at its strongest featured a fully evolved starter with coverage moves and a Bouffalant that the games presented as a reflection of his charging, unstoppable approach to every problem he encountered. His reunion with his sister's Purloin, recovered through the combined efforts of his journey and the players, was delivered quietly rather than dramatically, which was the franchise being honest about what resolution actually looked like after the adrenaline of pursuit was over. Bede. He was disqualified from the gym challenge for destroying a historical monument. This specific event, Bede using his Pokemon to excavate wishing stars from the mural at Stowan's side on Chairman Rose's orders, damaging an irreplaceable piece of Galarian history in the process, was the franchise's most consequential mid-game rival consequence, removing Bede from the competition he had spent the game being arrogant about in the least heroic way possible. He had started Sword and Shield as the franchise's most deliberately abrasive rival since Silver, dismissive of other trainers, contemptuous of the player's progress, operating with the specific self-certainty of someone who had been told they were exceptional and had accepted the designation without examining what it was based on. His expulsion from the gym challenge and subsequent recruitment by Opal, the Balonlee fairy-type gym leader who had been looking for a successor, redirected his arc towards something none of the game's previous story beats had suggested was coming. Opal was 88 years old. She chose Bede specifically. His talent was genuine regardless of his attitude, and she had enough experience with talented people to know that the attitude was the thing to address rather than the talent. His eventual position as a gym leader, having been taken in and transformed by someone old enough to see past his defensiveness, was the franchise's most unexpected rival landing. The character who had been the most difficult to like becoming the one whose journey required the most work and produced the most complete result, Kieran. He was proud of his discipline on the first day, the specific image of Kieran showing the player his favorite Pokemon with the eagerness of someone who had never had a friend before to share it with established immediately what the Teal Mask's rival arc was building toward. A character whose capacity for joy and connection was present and genuine before the events of the DLC, systematically compressed it into something that looked nothing like what it had started as. The loss of Ogerpon's trust to the player at the Teal Mask's conclusion was the event that started the process. Kieran had loved the legendary Pokemon, had built his sense of self partly around being the person Ogerpon trusted, and watching the player receive that trust in a single day was experienced as confirmation of something about himself that he immediately began trying to disprove through training. The Indigo Disc found him as Blueberry Academy's champion, the shy, eager boy replaced by something that the community documented as one of the franchise's most effective rival transformations. A character who had become clinically precise where he had been open, who had pursued competitive optimization as a response to emotional loss, who needed to be stopped rather than simply challenged. His team at the Indigo Disc's climax was built at the level of an actual competitive player's optimized party. His recovery, which the DLC depicted as partial and ongoing rather than complete, was the franchise's most honest engagement with the idea that the damage a rivalry can do is not always undone when the rivalry ends. Silver, he stole his first Pokemon, not as an act of rebellion against a system he disagreed with, not as a statement of ideology, not through any framework that made the theft legible as principle. He walked into Professor Elm's lab and took a Totodile because he wanted a strong Pokemon, and taking was faster than receiving. His identity as Giovanni's son was information the games disclosed slowly across the Gold and Silver experience, and its full implications accumulated gradually. The crime organization he despised for the weakness he associated with sentiment and attachment had been run by his father, which meant his contempt for the things Team Rocket represented was not purely philosophical, but personal, and that the specific intensity of his rejection of friendship with Pokemon was connected to what friendship with the man who had run Team Rocket had cost him. He was the franchise's only genuinely antagonistic rival before the Generation 8 era, not competitive like Blue, not pursuing a separate goal like Hugh, but actively hostile to the player in the specific way of someone who had decided vulnerability was the thing that destroyed people and was not going to let himself be destroyed by it. His growth across the game was not resolution but movement. He did not become friendly, he became less brittle, which was the franchise's honest acknowledgement that people who had built their entire identity around contempt did not simply open up because they lost enough battles. His eventual improvement came incrementally and imperfectly. That was why it landed. Blue. He was always ahead in every version of Generation 1, in every encounter, in every town the player reached after traveling a route Blue had already traveled. There was evidence that he had been there before, had done what was required, had moved on to the next milestone before the player had finished the current one. His most devastating deployment of this was the Pokémon League itself. The player defeated the Elite Four and walked through the final door expecting to face an empty throne or a final gauntlet, and Blue was already there. He had defeated the Elite Four before the player arrived. He was champion before the player knew the battle was going to happen. The franchise's entire rivalry concept, the persistent opponent who pushed the player forward through competition, who knew you personally enough to make defeating them feel meaningful, who was simultaneously the antagonist and the mirror, was established by Blue before any subsequent rival had the chance to learn from it. His post-game position as the Viridian City gym leader in Gold and Silver reached after he had processed both losing the championship and whatever had followed it in the years between games, was delivered without explanation, a trainer sitting in a gym without telling anyone how he had gotten there or what the experience had produced in him. The franchise trusted the player to supply the context. The player always had the context. It had been building since the moment Oak called them both into his lab and told Blue to pick first.